Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 78 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. We're going to be doing something a little bit different today. For those of you that are new to the show, my name is Simon Dixon. I've been involved in investing in money and monetary reform and Bitcoin for about the last 25 years or so. And normally I go live with This Week in Bitcoin, Macro, and Geopolitics. But I'm going to do that in a very different way today. We're going to be digging deep into the Scott Bessent interview, the US Treasury Secretary that is lying to everyday Americans and the world right now. And I'd like to make sure that you are 10 steps ahead, because if you're not, my fear is that a lot of people are falling for the narrative of what this actually means. It is being pitched as a redistribution from Wall Street to Main Street. And tariffs are the mechanism by which they want you to believe that happens in America. And this is being wrapped in a Make America Great Again narrative. But these prostitutes are working for the large multinational corporations that are using these tariffs in order to actually execute one of the largest wealth transfers from Main Street over to Wall Street. And I want to break it down and make sure you understand it. And so what I wanted to do, rather than just give you the normal This Week in Bitcoin, This Week in Macro, and This Week in Geopolitics, I'm going to go through step by step the interview of what you're led to believe. And I'm going to retranslate it. And I'm going to translate it away from the PR and jargon over to the financial terrorism that it actually is. And what I'd love for you to do is bear with me. It's about a 22-minute interview, and I'm going to play it. It's going to be a speech. You'll notice that it was scripted and drafted by the International Monetary Fund to the International Monetary Fund. And when I say International Monetary Fund, these are just one player in what I call the proof of weapons network. As a quick recap before we start the interview, and I'm going to tie it all into everything that's happening today so that you can be 10 steps ahead and prepare accordingly. Judge me by where this happens. I've done this many times, and you can judge whether the things that you may think sound extreme, bookmark it, come back in 1 year and tell me how I did. Because I remember the day that Putin invaded Ukraine and the video, the emergency broadcast that I released, where I said this would be a strategic escalation by the CIA, and it would lead to putting the bricks further together. It would lead to Trump winning the election and then Trump being installed in order to be blamed for the fall of the dollar and the end of the American empire. And if you go back to that video, everyone was telling me in the comments how crazy I was, that I'm a conspiracy theorist, that it wasn't even possible for Trump to get reelected. And look how it turned out. Now, I would like you to suspend disbelief and do the same. I'm used to being called crazy names. I'm the guy that left, investment banking to tell people about the debt-based Ponzi scheme that the banks had created through the Federal Reserve System and the proof of weapons network that got people ahead of the financial crisis. And then in 2011, at $3 a Bitcoin, was telling everybody that this proof of work is going to be the anti-proof of weapons network. And I've been ridiculed all the way through, so I'm used to it. I don't mind. I'm used to that. But right now, we are seeing the end of an era, the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, that I already got everyone that subscribes to this channel way ahead of. And I'm going to go through, by going through this interview with Scott Bessent, this is going to be very educational, and I want you to become an expert at recognizing how they lie to you in order to leave you as the bag holder while they do the opposite of their money. We never listen to the politicians. We don't listen to the media. We follow the money, understand what they're doing, and that allows me to get everybody ahead, and I publish it every week. And so we're going to be going through what the net effect is of April the 2nd, 2025, what President Trump called Liberation Day. And it was actually liberation. It was liberating the entire world from the dollar. And I'm going to walk through the economics, the geopolitics, and the macro side and help you understand it from the perspective of what they are telling you. So we're going to experiment with something new. Hopefully all the technology holds up. I've got Azad with me, and he's going to play the video. And then when I start speaking, the video will stop, and then we'll go back in. We'll just strategically go through until we've done all 20 minutes. And I'm going to give retranslations of how to take the PR and propaganda and expose it for the financial terrorism that it actually is. And your job is to spread the word, understand it, make your move, decide what you're going to do, and make sure that you protect yourself, because they certainly ain't protecting you. And this is not about making America great again unless you make the same moves that they're making, which is shorting the dollar, longing Bitcoin, and the central banks are all going into gold while there is a massive capital outflow, and they redistribute and they make deals, what they're calling deals, that ain't going to help America, but they are going to help the large multinational global financial institutions and corporations that own the politicians, that paid for Trump. I'm talking about the Elon Musks that paid for Trump. I'm talking about the Bank of New York Mellon family that paid for Trump. I'm talking about the Israel First Adelson that paid for Trump, the largest contributors to his campaign, which always come with terms and conditions. As he does the bidding for BlackRock, he's negotiating a deal with the Chinese government to hand the Panama Canal and 26 other ports over to either BlackRock or to China. And these are the negotiations that it happens when you have securitized and financialized your entire industry, and it no longer becomes about America for the Americans or Europe for the Europeans or Britain for the Brits. It becomes weaponizing, scraping, financializing, and asset stripping every ounce that you can for the corporations that install the politicians that exert these. And I just want to, as a reminder, I've created videos in the past. You can go back to previous videos where I cover and break down the proof of weapons network. As a quick recap, and then we're going to jump straight into the Scott Bessent interview. As a recap, the proof of weapons network, to take a Bitcoin and proof of work analogy, has 3 layers. Layer 1 is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve works for its shareholders. Who are its shareholders? The large banks that are global financial institutions that reallocate capital, and they perpetuate a debt-based Ponzi scheme, because the Federal Reserve, who regulates their own shareholders, and they have other subsidiaries like the OCC, essentially engineers the system for its shareholders, and its shareholders are the banks. And the banks they're not America first. And they tell Jerome Powell what to say each quarter. They set the agenda. They meet with other players in the proof of weapons network, and they redirect the flow of capital in order to maximize the profits for their own institutions, whether it's America first or not. If it's in line with it, capital has no integrity. If it means that they need to wage a war and a covert war, they'll do that. No, that's one of the most profitable ways of doing it. And we're going to go through the institutions. Anyway, layer 1 is the central bank. They have a debt-based Ponzi scheme where they create money every time they issue a loan, and the interest to repay the loan doesn't exist. And therefore, you create a debt cycle, which requires, in order to have more dollars, you have to have more debt. And they work with other institutions like the IMF in order to perpetuate dollar debt through economic hitmen. And they destroy current countries. They wage covert wars. They rape, pillage, and steal. And they take countries and force them into dollar debt through the IMF. And that creates the demand for dollars. And in the host country, America, you end up having a trade deficit, because your job is exporting dollars, normally exported through creating wars and covert wars, and exporting debt. And because that debt tends to congregate in the hands of those that are able to create the money, i.e. the banks, or those that are able to borrow the money at 0%, the mortgage-backed securities and the various other corporate bonds that happen during quantitative easing, those that are able to borrow, they get to rig the system in their favor, because everyone else is paying 30, 40% on credit cards in order to consume, or 40% payday loans because they can't afford to pay their next rent. And so it is a slow transfer through getting the government deeper into debt, which is, essentially having a too big to fail banking system that socializes losses and privatized gains, creates a hidden tax called inflation, and creates a debt-based Ponzi scheme where eventually the government ends up like it is today, $37 trillion in debt, mainly through war, and a society that can barely afford to live, and an inflated assets that redistributes wealth, where you have exactly what you have today. I know this because it happened with the Bank of England in England, and it's happening with the ECB in Europe, and it's happened with the Federal Reserve in America. That is one network that works together through this Bank for International Settlements and International Monetary Fund Network that uses the fund management industry like BlackRock's and various other things. I don't want to go too deep into that. Anyway, that's layer one. Layer two is what they call the deep state, the intelligence agencies. The CIA, Mossad, MI6, Five Eyes, they have a division that works for national security, but the vast amount of their intelligence is actually used to create covert wars and to assassinate, blackmail, kill outside of congressional process or parliamentary process. And it is used for corporate interests. So if you need to, create violence in Africa, then you fund a militia like M23 and you do it via a proxy like USAID. You get that money over to Rwanda. Rwanda then gets the militia groups, recruits them, makes them think it's something else, like extremists trying to fight each other. You use the media in order to control the narrative and make it, you think it's some kind of religious war or crazy thing like that, when really they're just paid militia. And then you use those in order to extract resources, kill people, rape, massacre, steal and pirate those resources so that they can be exported and sent to large multinational financial institutions that can sit down with layer three, the government, and rig the game and tell them that, right, we will pay you this amount of money and your job is to get all of these lithium or these resources or create violence and, fund ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And then you create violence and that makes 7.5 trillion that the Fed can print, send it back to the military contractors, and then they get to use the IMF, destroy their currency, overthrow their governments, and rig the whole game so that all of their money comes back into America, props up the system, creates inflation for the average American, and then they get to, the corporations get to then essentially control the political process. And then they invest it globally when the world order changes. So the debt-based Ponzi comes to an end at some point, and then you switch host countries, change your world order. You can either do that through war, or you can do a peaceful transition. And that is what the tariff war is all about right now. So layer three is the government. And the government is installed people, all of Senate, Congress. You pay for them. They do your policy. And then the intelligence agencies can either smear them, blackmail them, assassinate them, kill their careers, not allow them to get into power in the first place, or even build them up, like J.D. Vance, for example. He was built up by Palantir. Palantir is military industrial complex, AI, big tech meets big, military. And you use installed entrepreneurs, which are given technology that was created by the military industrial complex to play successful entrepreneur, like Peter Thiel. And then they can move capital around for the network, the mafia that exists on top of them. And they get to push out the narratives and use Silicon Valley in order to take that technology and then repurpose it through endowment funds and fund management and all sorts of things in order to make you think that you have a democracy. And then they distract you through thinking that you're fighting between left and right, Republican, Democrat. They can even fund civil unrest. They can change border policies. And then they can push religious narratives like a Muslim invasion or, everything was the Jews, a Jewish conspiracy. And then they push people that go farther and further into those extremes, which manufactures consent for hate, civil unrest. And with civil unrest, you get to change the laws, build it into a surveillance state and change the system. This is the proof of weapons network. And it exists across what we call the collective West. And you go to these wars because you think you're fighting for democracy. And that is the proof of weapons network. It was started with the British pound and the Bank of England, and now it's the US dollar via the Federal Reserve. And now the world order is resetting itself, and Trump was installed in order to put together the perfect team, including Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent, the currency raider that worked with George Soros, that crashed the pound for $3 billion profits when they needed to change the order between the European Union and the pound. And the system then resets, and you have people like Howard Lutnick and Steve Witkoff, who were all involved in various operations for Mossad over time and CIA. And we can go through those. We've covered those in different episodes. Right. So that is the proof of weapons network. Now, what I would like you to do, understanding that you have the central bank layer 1, the intelligence mafia layer 2, government layer 3, then you have installed people that their job is to read scripts, just like Scott Bessent, and put a narrative that is acceptable to the people while they do the exact opposite of what they're telling you to do. And you end up the bag holder that's holding all the treasuries, holding all the stocks, while they're redistributing their wealth and using things like front-running Trump's, we've got a deal, we're doing a deal with China, push the stock market up 11%. And you had those, Trump it was in the White House with Charles Schwab, and he was saying, look, he made $1 billion today. I put those videos on my X. Make sure you follow those. Right. So anyway, that's enough of that. What I want to do now is, with that understanding, I want you to listen to the Scott Bessent interview, and Azad's going to play it quickly start it right now. And I'm going to stop and start talking, and I'm going to retranslate it into what he actually means when you follow the money rather than follow what they're actually saying. So without further ado, let's go straight into the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent approximately a day or so ago, giving his presentation on what's happening in the world to the Proof of Weapons Network, and recorded in order to manufacture consent for believing that this tariff war is going to somehow help Main Street, when it's going to be absolutely disastrous for Main Street. So without further ado, let's go straight into the first section, and then we'll start giving some commentary.
We'll join the Secretary on stage shortly after. Secretary Bessent, the stage is yours.
Good, and thank you. Excuse me. Good, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. In the final months of World War II, Western leaders convened the greatest economic minds of their generation. Their task, to build a new financial system. At a quiet resort high up in the mountains of New Hampshire, they laid the foundation for Pax Americana. The architects of Bretton Woods recognized that a global economy required global coordination. To encourage that coordination...
Let's jump straight into what he means by Bretton Woods. So, for those of you that know the real history, not the history that we were taught in order to manufacture consent for believing what we were told. World War I was about resetting the world order, splitting the world into two for the Proof of Weapons Network. It was after the Bank of England and the model was used in order to create the Federal Reserve in 1913. That then led to World War I in 1914. And at the same time, that World War I was used to make massive, massive shifts. It was to create an outpost for the Proof of Weapons Network in the Middle East called Israel. And Israel was a mechanism for ensuring that oil resources could be used and war could be created in order to make a lot of money out of the manufacturing base that was built. The idea was to create strategic tension in the region. You can read things like Operation Gladio, how this was done by Paul Williams. That's a great book. And it created the State of Israel. At the same time, it took all of the gold that was the Bank of England had basically extracted out of the British people through the colonial expansion. And it made a transition from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. That gold was transferred through currency, constructions. Israel was created in 1917 when Balfour, the British government, needed funding to get US into the war and declared Palestine to the Zionists to create Israel, which was done through Walt Rothschild, which was a prolific war financier. And at the same time, funded a revolution, let's call it a revolution, which was to overthrow the Russian Tsar and create communism, which led to the creation of the Soviet Union. The same financiers were funding the Soviet Union to create communism and the Federal Reserve in order to create a debt-based Ponzi scheme that would remove capitalism slowly and over time through a debt-based Ponzi scheme, convert it into socialism, and at its extreme, if you want, a technocracy or a communist or whatever, what came next. They didn't know the technology at the time. But it's slowly getting the government deep into debt, and then you manufacture a proof of weapons network where you can always sell war. So you had this strategic tension between capitalism and communism, and you had a mechanism for extracting and creating violence in order to gain access to all the oil and the resources that were needed for the large multinational corporations that were building the Industrial Revolution and everything that came from that. Now, this led to the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles was where Germany's gold was redistributed, and it was essentially, taking all of Germany's debt from that war and packaging it up and destroying the German economy, where it turned into the Weimar Republic, which was one of the worst economies as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. All of the gold was confiscated. The gold came from overthrowing the Russian government. The gold came from the British colonialism, and it all ended up around about Fort Knox through the Federal Reserve System. And now the job was to get the government deep into debt. Now we had World War II, and World War II was when Hitler essentially arrested the Rothschild, expelled the debt-based Ponzi scheme central bank, and then believed, because of what happened to the Russians, because the Bolsheviks, because some of the leadership was Jewish, he believed in a Jewish conspiracy theory that was happening to Germany. And then the rest is history. But both sides were funded by the same mechanism. But they made it look like that there was, these different types of wars, but it was profitable for both sides. And then they used that in order to negotiate deals like the Havara Agreement, where the Jewish people in Germany that had been persecuted by the British Empire ended up, being exported to Palestine, and 60,000 of them caused carnage over there because they then funded militia groups and terrorist groups. And then the innocent people that were just being, told that they need to go over there turned into this whole Jewish conspiracy that they weaponized in order to justify the profits of the proof of weapons network. This then led to, at the end of the war, the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system said, because America and the Federal Reserve System has all the gold, they managed to convince every country. They installed the Bank of Japan in Japan. They installed the construct in Germany and Italy, the central banks that would later merge into the European Central Bank, in order to divide the world up. And after this, we obviously entered into the Cold War, which was very profitable for the proof of weapons network. And so you could tier up. And if you read Operation Gladio, you'll notice that there's these things called, you fund militias and you manufacture consent for all the violence that happened, and you make it look like it's one of these religious groups. And then you use that in order to fund the wars, issue the loans, and basically take advantage of all the resources you need. They created human trafficking networks, sex trafficking networks, weapons trafficking networks. It was all funneled via the Vatican Bank in Italy. And they got a 15% cut of all these transactions. Go into the book, if Operation Gladio, if you want to understand, a good foundation of how this stuff works. And that led to the creation of the next debt-based Ponzi scheme of how do you export this globally, and how do you keep the gold, collateralize the gold, get the government into debt, and create a system where we can export the dollar globally and make a load of money out of the communism versus capitalism manufactured narrative, and funding both sides. And that's exactly what happened. So Bretton Woods was essentially a meeting where they said, right, we'll install these central banks in our network. The Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland will become the epicenter. The Bank of England, which was also connected through the Federal Reserve, needed a mechanism for exporting dollars globally. And so the next thing that was created was free floating currencies. And so they said, right, you all come off the gold standard, we'll keep the gold, and you trade your currency, and we'll create a new organization called the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF was a mechanism for saying, everybody trade their currencies against the dollar, and the dollar will be convertible into gold. And so we would have a gold standard via the dollar, and everybody could then convert it. And the International Monetary Fund was an organization in order to complete those trades. They also set up the World Bank, and the World Bank will issue dollar loans to countries that install a central bank through the Bank for International Settlements network and install a debt-based Ponzi in their country. And then we can expand this network of debt-based Ponzi schemes that all come back into, like, think of them as node operators for the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And then we can coordinate on manufacturing the movement of global finance and create different mechanisms for centralization, like the fund management industry or endowment funds through education. And then we could use this money that comes back in order to control the education system. And then we could use the education system to make sure that the only education that gets out there is the one that sells drugs for big pharma, or that supports the petrochemical industry and various other types of things. And so this way you can create an economic model that says, let's not look at hard money and Austrian economics. Let's look at John Maynard Keynes, which says there has to be 2% inflation, i.e. perpetual debt, and theft through inflation. And when anything goes wrong, the government needs to step in and subsidize. And therefore, you can get the government deeper in debt. And so the education system said Keynesian economics is the model. And every central bank that adopts one of our central bank has to use Keynesian economics, even though that was never settled in economics. Okay, so now what do you need? You've got the IMF, you've got the World Bank, you've got all the gold here, you've got the Federal Reserve System, you've got the Bank for International Settlements, and we can make sure that if for any reason we get the government too deep into debt, it can be convertible into gold. Now, what happened when they funded war? They did the Cold War. They did Cold War, and then they split Vietnam into two, made a load of money. They split Korea into two, made a load of money. They funded militia groups in Afghanistan in order to have groups that could then do their drug trafficking networks through poppy seeds, so that they could get the ghettos in America addicted to drugs through the layer 2. And remember, the layer 2 is the reason all the drugs get in through this, all the weapons get around, all of the different covert wars that are funded, all the things that they call terrorism, which is manufactured in order to have religious justification, so that the media that they fund can make you think that you're in a fight for survival and the Muslims want to kill the Jews, and various other conspiracy theories that they manufacture. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that creates extremism, because you think you're in a fight for your survival and your country is being blown up through war. And that is the Bretton Woods system. And so that is the reality of what the Bretton Woods system was. And the IMF became a mechanism for forcing the exports of gold globally. Now, with the world reserve currency means that you have to have the largest debt in the world in order to export those dollars. And therefore, everyone else starts manufacturing because it becomes expensive through the inflation and the strengthening of the dollar through this debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so therefore, it hollows out your manufacturing base. And that creates a trade deficit where you import more and you have to keep the debt going. So you get the world addicted to debt. You create credit cards. You create anything that will get debt and debt and debt. And then those at the top of the system that can borrow at 0%, they get all the money for free. That is the Bretton Woods system. And that is the system that's coming to an end. Now, it was meant to come to an end in 1971 when they funded the Vietnamese War. And because they were about to go broke, because everyone was asking for their gold, they said you can no longer have your gold. The dollar is no longer convertible into gold. They went down to about 8,000 tons of gold. And we entered into the system of two military, nuclear powers, the Soviet Union, manufactured communism, and the manufactured capitalism, which was the fake capitalism of the Federal Reserve, that was a debt-based Ponzi scheme to make the government bigger and bigger and bigger through exporting more globally in order to back up the dollar. They created the petrodollar system, where once they exploited, via Israel, they manufactured exploiting all those oil resources with Saudi Arabia, priced those in dollars. And then they did the same with the euro dollar system. And you could slowly confiscate wealth. But because they had world reserve currency, the manufacturing base that was built in China, and by the way, this was by policy, would end up with all the surplus reserves, and Saudi Arabia and the oil exporters would end up with all the reserves, and they ended up building economic power over time, while the Bretton Woods system, anyone that had a debt-based central bank ended up in absolute dire wealth confiscation through asset stripping the economies and manufacturing inflation to steal from the middle class. And if they didn't adopt that system, they ended up on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network. So if you comply with us, we'll defend you and sell you weapons. If you try to be a competition, we'll destroy you through covert war, and then we'll profit from all the death, destruction, rape, and pillaging. We'll steal all those assets, and we'll create neo-colonialism dressed up in we are exporting democracy and we're the leaders of the free world. And this is the system that essentially has been fought against. And that's why we have BRICS. That's why all of the countries in the Middle East, or various ones, the GCC, are normalizing right now and built large surplus reserves. And the different countries that were sanctioned, they got together, they unified in order to build a power block as the financial institutions were asset stripping everything from America. And then they again entered into the war that we've been seeing. The GCC and BRICS won that war. And now you need to install Trump in order to reset the world order. And tariff policies were the perfect mechanism for doing that. I'll go deeper into that. I just wanted to give you that intro. And now, Azad, let's go into the next section. That is the Bretton Woods system.
They created the IMF and the World Bank. These twin institutions were born after a period of intense geopolitical and economic volatility. The purpose of the IMF and the World Bank was to better align national interests with international order, thereby bringing stability to an unstable world. In short, their purpose was to restore and preserve balance. This remains the purpose of the Bretton Woods institutions. Yet everywhere we look across the international system today, we see imbalance. The good news, it doesn't have to be this way. My goal this morning is to outline.
By imbalance, they mean the manufactured imbalance that the CIA, the level 2, created in order to print more money so that the banks could fund all of these wars, and the IMF could be used as the mechanism for destabilizing all of these different regions and gaining hegemon power. But there was one competing force, and by having one competing force, i.e. the Soviet Union, then you can benefit from both sides of the system, and you can have this strategic tension that justifies all of the wars. And then you can use your criminal network in layer 2 in order to do human trafficking, weapons trafficking, and drugs trafficking. and then get all of those resources that are needed for those large corporations that then want to extract all of the value at the expense of the host countries, i.e. the Europeans, the Brits, the everyday Brits, and the everyday Americans. And those large multinational financial institutions use layer 3, the government, in order to put a PR campaign on top of the wars that they would fund and getting those resources. And that would create enemies. You know, all of the resources across Africa were completely exploited. We had the world split into the global south and the global north as a result of all the money through these central banks coming back. So the goal was to manufacture chaos for layer 2 so that layer 1 could get all of that money to the banks and financial institutions and the corporations that were needed that could get access to those loans. So it was never to stabilize. And that is the exact design of the system. Eventually, that would lead to the failed ideology of communism. You know, the Soviet Union falling in 1991, the Berlin Wall falls, and then you enter into a full debt-based Ponzi scheme by coming off the gold standard in 71 and making it where nobody could put any kind of control. That was the system that was designed. Now, they knew to export dollars, they were going to end up with massive trade deficit, massive wealth confiscation, massive wealth redistribution, massive profits for those that could create the money, and massive debt for the government where you can never pay off the debt. If you pay off the debt, remember, the dollar is debt. So if you pay off the debt, you create a recession. And therefore, the Federal Reserve, anytime it wants to destabilize, it can hike rates, it can reduce rates, it can co-opt the OPEC countries in order to decide whether they push the price of oil up by constricting the reserves of oil or not. And you enter into this destabilizing force dressed up as a stabilizing force. And so don't believe a damn word that he says. In the end, you end up with a debt-based Ponzi scheme that eventually leads to civil unrest because the wealth confiscation gets so big that you end up with those on the extreme left that are wondering how the system screwed them, and those on the extreme right that are able to buy political gain, think that the left are crazy, and then you can create this extreme, ideological divide that eventually, when the empire ends, you can do things like fund open borders in order to create ideological, racial-driven, religious types of wars, in order to then eventually end up with the justification for creating something that looks very much like totalitarianism or extreme socialism or even communism with a central bank digital currency. Even both of those. That's what's happening in Europe, but we'll go further into the speech because he talks about Europe as well. So let's go further into the speech.
A blueprint to restore equilibrium to the global financial system and the institutions designed to uphold it. I have spent the bulk of my career from the outside looking in on financial policy circles. Now I am on the inside looking out. I am eager to work with each of you to restore order to the international system. To achieve this, however, we must first reconstruct the IMF and World Bank reconnect the IMF and the World Bank with their founding missions. The IMF and World Bank have enduring value, but mission creep has knocked these institutions off course. We must enact key reforms to ensure the Bretton Woods institutions are serving their stakeholders, not the other way around.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Right, so if we unpack that a little bit, what is he essentially saying is the way that this system was designed is through plausible deniability. So, for example, when the British Empire created Israel through the Rothschild network, and America started funding the militia group that led to the creation of the terrorism industry, and then they created National Endowment of Democracy and USAID in order to fund those groups, create strategic tension between Iran and Israel in order to manufacture $7.5 trillion of war. And then you create fake insurrections by creating wars, and then paying people to recruit those extremists because their families have been killed. And then you pretend it's about religion when they're actually just people that are being paid by those groups. They think that they're fighting some kind of ideological war against the people that killed their families. And then you create groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and then you create, anytime you want to bomb those countries, extract their resources, or gain more territory through ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, then you do it through a covert war and pretend that you're fighting terrorism and various other mechanisms. And so this is the construct that was set up in order to allow that to happen. Now, the IMF is a US dollar layer 1 and layer 2 institution. But layer 3, the government, pretend that it's like some other type of institution. And so what you saw during the Trump administration is immediately they set out by dismantling everything that propped up the proof of weapons network. Why? Because Trump's policy, who funds Trump? Trump's 3 main backers, first was Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the technocratic social credits guy, stateless type of guy that was given many military industrial complex technologies to become one of the richest people in America. The PayPal mafia, like with Peter Thiel, that funds all the artificial intelligence, military industrial complex technology that currently is creating genocide within Palestine at the moment. This PayPal mafia, he's the number 1 funder. The second funder is the banker, the Mellon banking family dynasty. So that's the banking network. And the third funding is Adelson, which is the Israel First kind of lobby part of it. So those is where most of Trump's money comes. Now, when they pay 100 million, 150 million, those large types of money, it comes with terms and conditions. And essentially, your job is to put somebody in charge, back somebody that has the perfect narrative for the type of political narrative that's needed to make people still think they got a democracy. So Trump had been talking about tariffs for ages. Trump, was deeply connected with, if you're involved in New York real estate, come on, then you're involved in the types of networks that have been infiltrated, i.e. the Italian mafia, the various other types that you have to hang around with in order to get access to those deals, including the Wexner network, which is where there was a blackmail ring called Jeffrey Epstein, which is why you see those different photos, which was a Mossad blackmail and CIA blackmail network, so that you can control influential people and call in favors. Or you can construct deals that make them a lot of money, or you can just simply pay them, or you can have assassination attempts to tell them what will happen, and then you compromise them, and then they have to do what you say, or they volunteer to do what you say. I don't really care what mechanism they use, but this is how layer 1 and layer 2 work. This is how they use layer 2 in order to install the politicians that then enact the policy for the large multinational corporations. Now, these different constructs like Israel allows you to have plausible deniability. So when you create crimes against humanity to prop up the dollar for the profits of the banks and the companies, at some point, people might catch on. And so you need plausible deniability. So plausible deniability is, it was Israel that blackmailed us. You allow things like a Jewish conspiracy and a Muslim invasion narrative, and you perpetuate those through the media and organizations like X, where you allow videos to go through. You can exert regime changes by pushing out the algorithm, and then you can manufacture hate that radicalizes the people, just like 9/11 radicalized the Europeans and the Americans in order to go to war, to steal Saddam Hussein's gold, to make sure that the oil wasn't priced in euro rather than dollars, to make sure that you could control those different networks and create the 7 different wars from the Clean Break memo, which was a Mossad CIA operation that they used Pentagon. And you need to get Americans and Europeans to buy into that. So you do something like 9/11, And then with 9/11, you manufacture the narrative that is necessary in order to radicalize people to fight those wars, to make them think that they're fighting for freedom. They're fighting for their religion. They're doing God's work. They are the chosen people that are there in order to survive because everyone else wants to kill them. And those that want to kill them are paid for by the same side. And you radicalize that side by killing their families and ruining their lives. And so this all strategic tension makes a lot of profit. And that's the constructs. And so what you do is you pretend like the IMF wasn't created for the dollar. So what did the Trump administration do? Well, firstly, the first thing they did is they said, we're coming after the deep state. We're going to expose USAID and the National Endowment of Democracy. These were organizations that fought for dollar and central banking and IMF loans by creating and funding all of these different types of terrorist groups and manufacturing the consent. So if you get rid of that, you can say, I'm coming after the deep state. When actual fact, you're actually weakening the dollar and weakening the power that keeps the proof of weapons network alive. Why would they do that? What else did he do? He said, I'm coming out of United Nations. United Nations is corrupt. We're winning. We're going to make America great again. They're stealing all of our money. What is United Nations? United Nations is how you veto vote against the world that is convicting you for the crimes against humanity. Now, when you want to overthrow, some kind of African dictator that you bribed and you sent all that money to through USAID, and you want to say they're corrupt, then you can use your veto vote in order to make them look like they're committing crimes against humanity while you're funding all the mechanism to steal their resources. And that corrupt dictator looks like I can just blame him. Plausible deniability. Gaddafi is an exact example with Libya. Assad with Syria. And it's better if they are crazy, horrible people. So if you give them chemical weapons or you allow them to get chemical weapons, then you can control the narrative and say, and turn his people against them. And the more evil you can make them, the easier it is to overthrow them when you need to overthrow them, because the people rebel. And then you create colored revolutions where people rebel against them. And you put guns in there through your weapons trafficking network to say that students that were protesting, let's suddenly create some violence. Let's kill someone. And then using that, you then create a violent uprising, and then you record it and you say, oh, these are the Islamist terrorists that are fighting against, and they're trying to kill the people. And then you can infiltrate it, manufacture the consent for regime changing, overthrowing the government, executing military coups. And this is what, if you read the book Covert Regime Change and Confessions of an Economic Hitman, those that work for the IMF and those that work for the Pentagon and those that were involved in these documents that ended up declassified can share exactly how these operations happen. And this is what justifies all of that war and all of that happening. Right. So United Nations is weakening the dollar and weakening America's ability to control and manufacture the environment that perpetuates the proof of weapons network. What else do? You crash the petrodollar and the eurodollar. The petrodollar required all of that violence in the Middle East. Now, what about the eurodollar? NATO. NATO is a salesman, a sales strategy for the US military industrial complex, where you put and install puppet governments and you fund the media like they did. The BBC was fully, much of it was funded by USAID in 2024. You push out a narrative, this guy is the next Hitler. You agitate through layer 2, the war, and then when they respond, and you end up making a load of money through war, and you can play these power games in order to destroy Europe, for example, which is what the Ukraine war was about. CIA coup in Ukraine, install different leadership. They then allow NATO to expand. NATO agitates Russia out. You end up with the scenario that ends up with essentially the Trump administration and the Biden administration doing what they're doing now, negotiating for BlackRock and corporate interests how to take half that land. Russia ends up with that land and do rare earth deals that are needed for batteries for Tesla and laptops for Apple and the large multinational corporations that it needs these resources. And so layer 3 is just doing the bidding of the corporations that are created through the Federal Reserve and layer 2 intelligence operations. So now, what else did you do? You do USID, you do United Nations. Coming out of NATO means you're pushing the war budget away from America. Now, America doesn't now have this larger, this twin deficit. By having a trade deficit, which is required to have world reserve currency, you can weaken the dollar and remove the world reserve currency status, but get the money back in for the military industrial complex that you're losing in other regions, and make sure that Europe is, or the ECB is printing $800 billion or stealing $350 billion that was sanctioned. Then you can take that $1 trillion and you can make sure that the corporate contractors, while you're weakening the dollar, get their money, and they can have that either through euros or through gold or through any other type of mechanism, but you crash the euro dollar in order to take out their system. What about coming up against the IMF? That's what Bessent is doing. By criticizing the IMF and saying you're no longer doing your job, it's a theater for the IMF was our layer 1 and layer 2. And layer 3 is pretending that they're not doing the bidding of the layer 2 and layer 1 IMF. And then you can weaken the IMF in order to weaken the dollar, which leads to capital outflows. Now, why is that happening? Because the reality is that Trump was installed because BRICS and the GCC had already won the wars against Europe, Israel, and America. And so rather than go to World War III, the backers of the Trump administration puts together the perfect team, like Scott Bessent, the currency raider, Mossad agents, or people that are connected to an Israel first policy, like Howard Lutnick, and like Marco Rubio, and like Steve Witkoff, and like Donald Trump. And they push the narrative that's needed in order to make people think we're coming up against the deep state, layer 2, and we're going to expose it. I'm going to release the Epstein files, the JFK files, but we're only going to release the bits of information. And there's a bit of a power struggle, but all of this is about, and then you say, I know, let's pretend we're coming up against a fight. Trump is fighting Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell is a puppet for the banks that is told what script to write, to say, just as Scott Bessent is reading his script. And Trump can go off script and create craziness when no one wants to invest in America anymore because you're creating an environment which is not stable for global capital. So this is how you push out. Now, those that own America and control America, i.e. those at layer 1 and layer 2, which are global, they reset the world order. The central banks buy all the gold. BlackRock creates an ETF and gets everyone into Bitcoin. Then all of the banks are in Bitcoin, and then they can go into neutral assets while they reset the world order. And then on April the 2nd, you get Trump to say, Liberation Day, we're winning, which essentially means we're taking all the small businesses that rely upon China's exports, and we're going to have shelves empty. We're going to have a really hard time. We're going to crash Europe because of the war that we manufactured. Europe's going to do worse. America's going to do bad, but the large global institutions are going to acquire all these companies. And then we're going to negotiate for BlackRock and the large financial institutions so that all of the deals that are being done, yes, Vietnam's doing a deal. Cambodia's doing a deal. Argentina's doing a deal. And then by doing all of those deals, you're essentially negotiating the countries that are being crippled because they rely upon their export economy and they got all their IMF loans. You essentially allow them to be consolidated into the large financial institutions. And these large financial institutions and multinational organizations, they've all got factories in China already. They got investments in the Middle East and Qataris and GCC. And they've also got the technocrat, AI, and robotics investments in America, and they're asset stripping everything that's left from Europe. And so they're making money out of all of this. And people connected to the Trump administration, the hedge funds, they could borrow from the Bank of Japan. They can do the carry trade, and they can make shitloads of money as Trump says, we're doing a deal. We're not doing a deal. We're doing a deal. We're winning. We're not winning. tariffs. It was already known exactly what would happen. There is no war. There is no trade war. China's already won. BRICS unified with the GCC, and Trump was installed in order to execute the capital outflows, the weakening of the dollar, and the asset stripping of Europe, Israel, and America for the large multinational corporations that are working with those that have the large surplus and manufacturing bases in order to reset the world order and make sure that the large corporations end up with all the last assets while Main Street and the rest suffer. So once you know that, then you start to think about, we're pacing a narrative. What's the narrative? Oh, everyone's ripping off America. Let's make America great again. Let's rebuild the manufacturing base. None of that is going to happen because none of it makes sense. Because America is owned by large multinational financial institutions, layer 1, layer 2, and they install layer 3 in order to bribe politicians to put an acceptable MAGA narrative, a European first narrative, a Britain first narrative that most people in Europe and Britain don't believe, but there's a cult of people in America that still believe it because they want to come after the deep state and they want to believe that they're winning. And you can create massive problems by even deconstructing freedom of speech, by arresting people at universities, creating anti-Semitism laws, which is testing, removing the First Amendment, and manufacturing the type of environment that creates massive, massive problems, just like they beta tested in the UK and across Europe with all of the different violent operations that they were manufacturing as per Operation Gladio. Right, now we've got all the foundation information. Let's cut through the bullshit and let's go to the next part of the speech.
Finance will require clear-eyed leadership from the IMF and World Bank. This morning, I will explain how they can provide that leadership to build safer, stronger, and more prosperous economies all around the world. I wish to invite my international counterparts to join us in working toward these goals. On this point, I wish to be clear. America first does not mean America alone. To the contrary, it is a call for deeper collaboration and mutual respect among trade partners. Far from stepping back, America First seeks to expand U.S. leadership in international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. By embracing a stronger leadership role.
What this actually means is that the exact opposite of what he's saying. It means that we need to put an acceptable narrative to the American people while we asset strip all of their wealth and we scrape the barrel of the last assets of the global north, because the global south is where all of that capital is now going to be invested. And we're finally going to free the world, liberate the world from the dollar, from the IMF, from NATO, from the constructs of USAID, from the National Endowment of Democracy, from veto voting at the United Nations, because there is a new multipolar world and they won the war. But we decided, let's not go to World War III because that would have destroyed the proof of weapons network, because there was equal power rather than a global hegemon. And now we're going to shrink America into a regional power. We're going to slowly weaken the dollar, and we're going to create an economically turbulent environment to get capital outflows. And the Trump administration and the proof of weapons network are going to get all of these distressed deals, and they're going to invest around the world, and they're going to leave you with with the high interest rate treasuries and bonds. And now that Japan's selling their treasuries and China's selling their treasuries, we're going to make sure that you own more treasuries. And if you look at the largest contributors to treasuries right now, Japan's going down, China's going down, they're selling. The Swiss franc is going up, a neutral currency. The price of gold's going to record highs. Bitcoin's going up because the banks and financial institutions got in through the ETFs. And the rate to lend to the US government is going at record highs, but Cayman Island bonds are going up, which is the largest. Who is that? That's essentially BlackRock, the pensions, the endowment funds that are taking your money, your pension, and making you the bag holder of those treasuries. And more of it is being dumped onto the American people while they exit their investments and invest around the world. And they strip more through the volatility of the markets every time Trump says, we're doing a deal with China, we're not doing a deal with China. I'm going to fire Jerome Powell, I'm not going to fire Jerome Powell. All of those volatility makes a load of money for the hedge funds that are on the right side, and the hedge funds that are not connected, they get consolidated, and you consolidate power into these large multinational financial institutions. And so that's what's being done. Let's go back to the speech.
America First seeks to restore fairness to the international economic system. Nowhere is the imbalance I mentioned earlier more obvious than in the world of trade. That's why the United States is taking action now to rebalance global commerce. For decades, successive administrations relied on faulty assumptions that our trading partners would implement policies that would drive a balanced global economy. Instead, we face the stark reality of large and persistent U.S. deficits as a result of an unfair trading system. Intentional policy choices by other countries have hollowed out America's manufacturing sector and undermined our critical supply chains.
Okay, so this is where he's just completely lying to you. So the post-World War II Bretton Woods system and the coming off of the gold standard, and defaulting was a recognition that global financial institutions are going to asset strip, create war, and the countries that China was going to build the manufacturing base. And in order to have the world reserve currency, we're going to have massive twin deficits, fiscal deficits and trade deficits as we financialize and securitize everything. And we, service financial institutions, and then we can productize every aspect of America and then sell it to the foreign capital that, because they've got a manufacturing base and because they got resources. So what's the difference between Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has oil, but they use it for their people. America has oil, but they privatize it. And then those large institutions are able to own the oil while you pay the tax, you pay the inflation, and they get to, rig the system in their favor. And so by giving this doctrine of we privatize everything, financialize everything, you're basically just saying we're stealing it from the people. And you created this model where essentially China created a model whereby no corporation could do that to China. So if a corporation got too big, they became part of the government. And so by having this system, they maintained control and they redistributed all of their money into building their own infrastructure in their own country. And then they would build a manufacturing base, and they took 800 million people out of poverty. Yes. Are they authoritarian? Absolutely. Do governments create crimes against humanity? All of them do. However, the difference is that while America was creating crimes against humanity through covert, China and the people knew what their government were doing. They weren't being distracted by left and right. The government would reinvest and make the country more prosperous. And then it would reinvest, and America would create narratives, they're stealing our technology. While America's on 5G and China's on 10G. This is what you're seeing with all these different borders. What else did China do? As it became wealthier and wealthier with its surpluses, it ended up if you believe what they tell you, they'll tell you that China's only got like 2,500 tons of gold and America's got 8,500. They have probably about 22,500 tons by estimates. No one fully knows, but they don't disclose all of that because they have a longer term plan. They want to make you think that they're weak when they're strong. And they have a state banking system, which means that all the leverage means that you can't financialize and use the Chinese yuan for the benefit of the private banking sector, so the banks don't become more powerful than the government. And so now you have in America the privatization of all of the profits and the debt-based Ponzi scheme, the socialization of all the losses through tax and inflation, wealth inequality, and they get to use all of those assets and they don't reinvest in infrastructure. So America's infrastructure gets worse, drug addiction gets worse, mental illness gets worse. They have, birth rates get worse. Everything gets worse because all of this money is being siphoned up, not for the benefit of the people. Now, within China, they reinvest it. Yes, you get an authoritarian government. Yes, you get a social credit score. Yes, you get just overt control rather than covert control. But what else did they do? They said, because we've got a manufacturing base, we're going to create a Belt and Road Initiative where we'll invest in Africa, we'll invest in the global south, we'll invest in these regions so that you can become more economically powerful, fight the oppression of the IMF, and then from that, and you can buy all of our goods. So they're rebuilding partners while the IMF is destroying partners. And then you end up with countries today like Pakistan, where essentially you have a battle between the Belt and Road Initiative and the IMF, USAID that funds all of the militia, and then you sell a load of weapons to India. India becomes a conduit for the profits of the military-industrial complex. Pakistan has all of these covert regime changes where you arrest the leader, put them in prison. The IMF fights back. The US, the Belt and Road Initiative fights back. The country just becomes a vassal for either America or China. And anytime you want to escalate it, you say these Islamist terrorists that you created through these groups, and you say China has this Uyghur group, and you say, that it's something else to manufacture consent for all the violence that you create in the region. And then eventually you either retreat, and this is essentially what happened in Palestine. This is essentially what happened in Ukraine. And because Netanyahu didn't ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, and because Europe was weakened and Russia didn't allow the CIA to win, you end up with a resetting of the world order because BRICS and the GCC won the war. And then you get the scenario that you're having right now where Trump is installed and you get this radical change. And then you got to have people like Scott Bessent read the script of his bosses and pretend that this is about fairness, equality, making America better again, rebuilding its manufacturing base, and putting the acceptable narrative for you to not protect yourself and end up the bag holder of all of the distressed assets while they hedge around the world. Let's go back to the speech.
Economic security at risk. President Trump has taken strong actions to address these imbalances and the negative impacts they have on Americans. The status quo of large and persistent imbalances is not sustainable. It is not sustainable for the United States, and ultimately, it is not sustainable for other economies. Now, I know sustainability is a popular term around here, but I'm not talking about climate change or carbon footprints. I'm talking about economic and financial stability, the kind of sustainability that raises standards of living and keeps markets afloat. International financial institutions must be singularly focused on upholding this kind of sustainability if they are to succeed in their missions.
Okay, so let's deconstruct that. What he's essentially saying, he is manufacturing the consent to blame the IMF for what is about to happen. He is manufacturing consent to say it's because these people didn't do deals. It's because of evil China. It's because of all this thing to blame what is actually going to happen. It's manufacturing consent when Israel gets weaker and weaker and weaker and economically stripped and integrated into the GCC. He can basically say all of that genocide, that wasn't us, that was Israel bribing our politicians. That's why certain files come out, like JFK files, at certain times. And we've covered those in previous things. So this is all about manufacturing the consent for what is about to come next and make it like something completely different is happening here. Now, he also talked about the renewable energy. Now, remember, that was an operation. So the World Economic Forum and the United Nations strategic goals and the whole narrative around sustainable energy was actually China was building all of this renewable energy because it is dependent upon Russia and Iran and Saudi for some of its energy. But it was building all of that renewable energy. I mean, China's built a sun that can like power solar panels and all sorts of crazy things, the largest in all of that industry, but they were building it upon a manufacturing base. In Europe, they used that narrative and they forced Europe through the ECB and the European Union, which is not a European first institutions. This is representatives of large multinational corporate interest. They said, Germany, which is the most important country in the European Union, you have a manufacturing base and you have nuclear energy that is extremely cheap. Switch off that nuclear energy, start using your manufacturing base not to build things that are useful for your people and the European Union, but build renewable energy, which is incredibly expensive because you don't have a cheap manufacturing base like China. And then while you switch off your nuclear energy, we'll put you in a recession, we'll expand NATO across Ukraine, we'll get all of this collateralized through the International Monetary Fund for BlackRock, for the multinational corporations and the banks, and then we can take over that land, take over the wheat in Ukraine, take over the rare earth minerals that are needed for semiconductor chips, for artificial intelligence and laptop components and phone components. We can blow up Nord Stream pipeline so that you don't have Russia's cheap gas, and you can buy our gas that sends your economy into dependency upon the US. So then they start getting the gas from US, which it was so expensive, it drives their economy into recession. It tries to weaken Russia, but then Russia starts working closer to BRICS and working with China and Iran and various other countries, and is able to build up India, which basically buys the cheap gas, exports it to Europe, but the increase in price destroys everyday Europeans. People are choosing between eating and heating. You get this inflation cycle as a result of the money printing from the COVID operation. And all of that creates the environment to asset strip Europe, hollow out its manufacturing base, turn off its cheap nuclear energy, make sure it can't work with Russia. And unfortunately, Russia and BRICS defeated the CIA and the deep state level 2. And so now they sit around and negotiate the new terms, which were already negotiated under Biden, which was a puppet, as they all are. Don't think this is just Trump. This is all of them. And then they negotiate the terms, and then they reset the world order, install Trump, and then they do the tariff policy in order to execute it. And so that renewable energy was essentially supporting China, because now they can get energy independence and they've got some of the best technology from their cheap manufacturing base. And America gets its final asset stripping, the final companies, while it deploys capital globally, in selling some of that cheaper energy to Europe, and Europe becomes a vassal state so that the European Union and the ECB can wipe out any wealth from the Europeans and the Brits, while America gets smaller and smaller and smaller and just becomes a vassal state, just like Britain is for the military-industrial complex, for big pharma, for the banking lobby, just like European Union is, and full dependence upon a central bank digital currency. And then they beta test it on Europe, and then they manufacture the environment through these religious wars and immigration laws to create the violence to get people to accept deporting of students with no due process, and people are cheering it along. And then you get changes in laws, chuck people in Guantanamo Bay, sell them to El Salvador. They have no due process, and that creates the type of violence that's needed in order to end up in a social credit score through Elon Musk and the technocracy, where you transition the dollar to stable coins, and then you can control a covert version of exactly what's happening in China and exactly what's being beta tested in Europe. And then you can connect it to all the AI that Palantir is creating that's being beta tested in some of the more extreme wars, like the genocide that's happening in Palestine right now, all to scrape out the last asset strip and make people cheer it on while it's happening, because a new world order is being set, where those countries are investing in their people, rebuilding them, doing ties. Eventually, they'll turn on each other, because global capital and the military-industrial complex will create operations like they're doing in Pakistan right now to weaken BRICS so that they can get more strategic negotiations, sell more weapons, issue more loans, and create more dependencies while they negotiate the order that is happening right now. Back to the speech.
More than 100 countries have approached us, wanting to help rebalance global trade. These countries have responded openly and positively to the president's actions to create a more balanced international system. We are engaged in meaningful discussions and look forward to talking with others. China in particular is in need of a rebalancing. Recent data shows the Chinese economy tilting even further away from consumption toward manufacturing. China's economic system, with growth driven by manufacturing exports, will continue to create even more serious imbalances with its trading partners if the status quo is allowed to continue. China's current economic model is built on exporting its way out of its economic troubles. It's an unsustainable model that is not only harming China, but the entire world. China needs to change. The country knows it needs to change. Everyone knows it needs to change, and we want to help it change because we need rebalancing too. China can start by moving its economy away from export overcapacity and towards supporting its own consumers and domestic demand. Such a shift would help with global rebalancing that the world desperately needs. Of course, trade is not the only factor in broader global economic imbalances. The persistent over-reliance on the United States for demand is resulting in an ever more unbalanced global economy. Some countries' policies encourage excess savings, which holds back private sector-led growth. Others keep wages artificially depressed, which also suppresses growth. These practices contribute to global dependence on U.S. demand to spur growth. They also lead to a global economy that is weaker and more vulnerable than it should be. In Europe, former ECB President Mario Draghi has identified several sources of stagnation, and he has outlined several recommendations.
The video is still playing. Okay, let's jump into exactly what's being said here. So I want you all to look up something called Triffin's Dilemma, Triffins, Triffin's Dilemma. It's a concept in economics that Scott Bessent is very familiar with. It basically means if you want world reserve currency, then you have to have a trade imbalance and a fiscal imbalance to export those dollars. If you want to end world reserve currency, then you can reverse that, but it will enter into economic decline, and you can contract the number of dollars if you wanted to pay off the debt. This is the rules of the game. If you want more money, you have to have more debt. If you want less money, you have to have less debt, which comes with a recession that comes with it. So this is not about unfairness. This is the system that was deliberately set up in order to extract value, because that is what the world reserve currency does. And so by creating a narrative that China knows it needs to change, nothing will change. The rules have already been set. The trade war is over, and it will take a minimum of 2 to 3 years to negotiate a trade deal. He knows that. And then he's using volatility in the market to make people think a deal's coming through any second now. And then the market will go up. This is completely dishonest. And they need you to believe this because they need you. This is the only acceptable way of essentially saying that this is the system that we set up. And America is not America first. Europe is not Europe first. And Britain is not Britain first. We're asset stripping for the large multinational corporations. And that's exactly what this strategy is all about. Now, it's going to go a little bit deeper into Europe, and then we'll get to the next part.
To get the European economy back on the right track. European countries would do well to take his recommendations to heart. Europe has already taken some long overdue initial steps that I applaud. These steps create a new source of global demand and also involve Europe stepping up on the security front. I believe global economic relationships should come to reflect security partnerships. Security partners are more likely to have compatible economies structured for mutually beneficial trade. If the United States continues offering security guarantees and open markets, then our allies must step up with stronger commitments to shared defense. The initial actions from Europe on increased fiscal and defense spending are proof that the Trump administration's policies are indeed working. The Trump administration and the U.S. Treasury are committed to maintaining and expanding U.S. economic leadership in the world. This is especially true at the international financial institutions. The IMF and World Bank serve.
So you basically got the exact opposite of what is really happening. This is America saying we're committed to being the leader while they shrink into a regional power. And Europe, you need to print more money to extract more inflation from the Europeans, and then you're going to spend it back into military contractors because we can no longer print more money because we want to end the world reserve currency, because that was the negotiation that we had when we're going to split the world up into BRICS, America just as a regional power, sacrifice Europe, and allow the GCC as we retreat from the Middle East and allow them to normalize as we do a deal with Iran, a deal with Saudi Arabia, and we shrink Israel, economically destroy it. We have a Palestinian state and we hand over control to the countries that now have the economic power. And what do we get in return? We pretend that this is going to help Americans and Europeans and Brits while we extract the money and we reinvest it into deals into those regions that help those countries that are not fully controlled by global finance. And this was an alternative to World War III. Let's go back into the next section.
Critical roles in the international system, and the Trump administration is eager to work with them so long as they can stay true to their missions. And under the status quo, they are falling short. The Bretton Woods institutions must step back from their sprawling and unfocused agendas, which have stifled their ability to deliver on their core mandates. Going forward, the Trump administration will leverage U.S. leadership and influence at these institutions and push them to accomplish their very important mandates. The United States will also demand that the management and staffs of these institutions be accountable for demonstrating real progress. I invite all of you to join us in working to refocus these institutions on their core missions. It is in our collective interest to do so. The IMF. First, we must make the IMF again. The IMF's mission is to promote international monetary cooperation, facilitate the balanced growth of international trade, encourage economic growth, and discourage harmful policies like competitive exchange rate depreciation. These are crucially important functions to support the US and global economies. Instead, the IMF has suffered from mission creep. The IMF was once unwavering in its mission of promoting global monetary cooperation and financial stability. Now it devotes disproportionate time and resources to work on climate change, gender, and social issues. These issues are not the IMF's mission. And the IMF's focus in these areas is crowding out its work on critical macroeconomic issues. The IMF must be a brutal truth teller and not just to some members. Today, the IMF has been whistling past the graveyard. Its 2024 external sector report was entitled Imbalances Receding. This Pollyannish outlook is symptomatic of an institution more dedicated to preserving the status quo than answering the hard questions. Here in the United States, we know we need to get our fiscal house in order. The last administration ran up the largest peacetime deficit in our nation's history. The current administration is committed to fixing this. We are open to critique, but we will not abide the IMF failing to critique the countries that most need it, principally surplus countries. In line with its core mandate, the IMF needs to call out countries like China that have pursued globally distorted policies and opaque currency practices for many decades. I also expect the IMF to call out unsustainable lending practices by certain creditor countries. The IMF should push more proactively official bilateral lenders to come to the table early to work with borrower countries to minimize periods of debt distress. The IMF must refocus its lending on addressing balance of payment problems, and its lending should be temporary. When done responsibly, IMF lending is at the very core of its contribution to the global economy. When markets fail,
so what he's saying
the IMF steps in.
He's essentially saying we are ending the dollar economic hitmen, financial weapons of mass destruction, covert regime changes, and war destruction that gave us the power in the first place. And we would like these dollar loans to be minimized because there is a recognition that the funding's going to come from China. And he wants to blame this on the IMF as this strategic retreat happens because the world order is now being reset and those in charge have already set that world order. Let's go back to the next section.
And makes resources available. In exchange, countries implement economic reforms to resolve their balance of payments issues and support economic growth. The reforms undertaken during these programs are some of the IMF's most important contributions to a strong, sustainable, and balanced global economy. Argentina is a fitting example. I was in Argentina earlier this month to demonstrate the United States' support for the IMF efforts to help the country reset financially. Argentina deserves the IMF support because the country is making real progress toward meeting financial benchmarks, but not every country is so deserving. The IMF must hold countries accountable for implementing economic reforms, and sometimes the IMF needs to say no. The organization has no obligation to lend to.
Is the model of Argentina, obviously Milei was installed by the Proof of Weapons Network. And his job was to say, we'll privatize as many assets as we can for the multinational corporations and financial institutions because the IMF debt is unsustainable, which led to the complete destruction of all of the oil resources. And because we're going to scrape the barrel a little bit further, we're going to get Milei to transport Argentina's gold over to London. And because the Federal Reserve has many more paper gold contracts than gold that exists within Fort Knox, we need that gold from Argentina to go over to the Bank of England so it can be repatriated to America ahead of this. And when we want to weaken the dollar, finally, we can do something like inspect Fort Knox, or we could decide we don't need to do that. But if we want that tool, we can either try and replace the gold and show that it's there, or we can demonstrate that it's no longer there so that we can strategically use that as a complete tool in order to weaponize the American economy, where if those politicians or if that government or if any of those players don't play by the ball, we can change the game significantly. All of that happens way before the tariff policies, because this game was played over the last decade. And so global finance and global institutions are getting ahead, and they're doing wars to tests that they profit from. And depending on the outcome, they're resetting the chessboard, moving the capital, and coming up with the optimum profits, and installing the people that are needed. And then you get Elon Musk and Milei that all come with a chainsaw saying, we're finally taking on the system, and you can see this. Once you can see this, it's so obvious, and you just need to follow the money ahead of the game. And while everything's not a perfect science, things change. But this is how I tend to be able to try and get ahead of the trends. And this is the type of thing we always cover in Bitcoin Hard Talk when we cover This Week in Bitcoin Macro and Geopolitics. Right, so that's the Argentina game as an example. Let's go back into the video.
Countries that fail to implement reforms. Economic stability and growth should be the markers of the IMF's success, not how much money the institution lends out. World Bank. Like the IMF, the World Bank must be made fit for purpose again. The World Bank Group helps developing countries grow their economies, reduce poverty, increase private investment support, private sector job creation, and reduce dependence on foreign aid. It offers transparent and affordable long-term financing for countries to invest in their own development priorities. The bank, along with the fund, provides extensive technical support to promote debt sustainability among low-income countries, which empowers those countries to stand up to coercive and opaque lending terms from other creditors. These core functions of the World Bank complement the Trump administration's efforts to foster safer, stronger, and more prosperous economies in the United States and the world. But the bank, like the IMF, has strayed in certain respects from its initial mission. The bank should no longer expect blank checks for vapid, buzzword-centric marketing accompanied by half-hearted commitments to reform. As the bank returns to its core mission, it must use its resources as efficiently and effectively as possible. And it must do so in ways that...
So, firstly, the World Bank, which uses economic hitmen at the IMF and war and destruction in order to force debt slavery, the countries that have taken those IMF and World Bank loans have paid just the interest on the debt probably 6 times over, and they're still greater in debt than the original loan, which is designed to always be resource extraction, wealth confiscation from the local people in order to prop up the dollar. And that is what the World Bank is. This is extreme gaslighting, because if now that tool is being ended, what he is saying is in the New World Order, the GCC get to exert the capital, and China and BRICS get to exert the capital, because that was the strategic negotiation. And we're going to make sure that our institutions get as many deals as possible while we roll out and pretend that the deal is just around the corner and make America, Europeans, and Britons think that something different is happening to the fact that this is just complete extraction of the wealth, hollowing out the middle class, and pretending that it's going to make America great again. The World Bank is a predatory institution, and this is the strategic weakening of the tools that made up the post-World War II Bretton Woods system. And now the order is changing because strategic surpluses by design was set up, and now we're managing that change. Let's get back to the video.
Demonstrate tangible values for all member countries. The bank can use its resources more efficiently now by focusing on increasing energy access. Business leaders the world over identify unreliable power supply as one of the primary impediments to investment. The World Bank and African Development Bank's joint Mission 300 initiative to expand energy access to 300 million more people in Africa is a welcome effort. But the World Bank must respond to countries' energy priorities and needs and focus on dependable technologies that can sustain economic growth rather than seek to meet distortionary climate finance targets. We applaud the recent announcement that the World Bank will seek to remove prohibitions on support for nuclear energy, which could revolutionize energy supply for many emerging markets. We encourage the bank to go further in giving countries access to all technologies that can provide affordable baseload generation. The World Bank must be tech neutral and prioritize.
So this is actually really quite exciting and gaslighting at the same time. So firstly, what this is now the dollar, the economic boot, the liberation of the world from the dollar means that certain countries that have always been oppressed and held back, like many of the countries in the African regions, various countries in the global south, let's call it, they are now going to be allowed to get loans and be rebuilt using the GCC and the BRICS alliance. But he needs to do his sales strategy because the conditions are that the large technical institutions are going to invest and are already invested in BRICS and the GCC. And the last bit of value in America, the large technical companies, the robotics, the AI, the fact that they're going to automate all the jobs and take them away from the Americans and hand them over to robots. And they need energy in order to do that. So there'll be an ecosystem that takes, the oil turned into gas, and then gas refined into energy, and then rare earths into semiconductor chips into the components of data centers, and then data centers into AI, then the cryptocurrencies and the stable coins, and then the robotics that sit on top of that. That's the only thing that's going to be left within America. And that's already built within China. But what this is essentially saying is we're no longer going to hold back those countries, and you are going to be able to progress those countries. And now they get to have all the growth. We're going to invest in all those deals. Now that we've shorted the dollar and bought a bunch of gold, we'll redeploy that capital. We'll get interest. The bonds will pay higher and higher yields. We'll get those over to the American people, leave them as the bag holders in their pension. And then our technology companies will get contracts to provide that technology alongside whatever the negotiations are that have already been negotiated between the financial institutions that are negotiating with China, and the Trump and America are just representing their interests against the American people. That's what that means. It's the sales strategy for the corporations that are now asset stripping America, Europe, and the economies like Israel that was a strategic outpost that was dependent upon the dollar in order to exist. Those will now be normalized, those regions, because the GCC will be an area peace, and you'll see more and more normalization. Like I said a while back, I said Saudi and Iran, the China plan is the solution for peace in the Middle East, a Palestinian state, the removal of US so that you don't fund Israel to create carnage in the industry. And then the people that are left can go back to where they were when Jewish people, Muslims and Christians and various other people, without the unnatural narratives that manufactured all the consent and funding all the extremists from creating war and the USAID covert operations. All of that goes, they get to prevail, they get to rise, capital gets to, through ETFs, reinvest in these countries, and capital gets to leave America, weaken the dollar, put it into a regional power, and then it becomes a vassal state for the corporations to sell some of their technology to those countries, so that they're globally hedged as they transition to probably one world government, one world currency, and all the games that that these large institutions have always played. Back to the video.
Affordability in energy investment. In most cases, this means investing in gas and other fossil fuel-based energy production. In other cases, this may mean investing in renewable energy coupled with systems to help manage the intermittency of wind and solar. The history of humanity teaches a simple lesson. Energy abundance sparks economic abundance. That's why the bank should encourage an all-of-the-above approach to energy development. Such an approach will make World Bank financing more effective, and it will reconnect the bank to its core mission of economic growth and poverty alleviation. In addition to increasing energy access, the World Bank can use its resources more effectively by starting to apply its graduation policy. This would allow the bank to focus on lending to poorer, less creditworthy countries. This is where World Bank support makes the biggest difference for poverty and growth. Instead, the World Bank continues to lend every year to countries that have met the criteria to graduate from World Bank borrowing. There is no justification for this continued lending. It siphons off resources from higher priorities and crowds out the development of private markets. It also disincentivizes countries' efforts to move away from dependency on the World Bank and toward job-rich, private sector-led growth. Going forward, the bank must set firm graduation timelines for countries that have long since met the graduation criteria. Treating China, the second largest country in the world, as a developing country is absurd. While it has been at the expense of many Western markets, China's rise has been rapid and impressive. If China wants to play a role in the global economy commensurate with its actual importance, then the country needs to graduate up. We welcome that. The World Bank should also implement transparent...
This is the strategic posturing, trying to pretend that America still gets to dictate to BRICS and China, because they're still pretending that they're actually in some kind of trade war. Look, it's actually appropriate when we look at the real definition of the word to call China a developing country. Now, we know that you've used that as a derogatory term, so that you can use these economic hitmen. But actually, it's very appropriate because China did develop by investing in its people. What did America do? It developed, unveloped, by asset stripping all of its people and selling them a narrative that made them believe that what was happening to them was in their best interest, because everywhere else is not as good. And so actually, it's appropriate to call China a developing country, even though that has been repackaged. Because actually what it has done is, now that it is freed from, the countries are freed from the dollar, they will be able to develop. they will be able to grow, and they won't be held back. They won't have their governments overthrown. They won't have covert regime changes. They won't have insurrections from unnatural militia groups in order to extract those resources. And it won't have anything that the World Bank, the IMF, the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, the Bank of England, and the Proof of Weapons Network set up, which collectively, since the formation of the Bank of England, has probably led in all of the fake wars, or all of the covert wars, and all of the overt wars, to the death of 300 million people globally. And it turned against the American people, against the British people, against the European people, while we were indoctrinated into thinking that something else had happened. And so this is a very exciting time when you understand the dynamics and follow the money, because essentially he is delivering a speech that says that finally these regions will get a chance to actually be developed. Now, I'm not actually ignorant enough to say that we're going to enter into some kind of utopia, but I'm telling you that the end of the model of the Federal Reserve that came from the Bank of England, that propped up the dollar and all the gaslighting and all of the covert wars that happened, is slowly but surely coming to an end, because there are countries that are not controlled by the Proof of Weapons Network, but they are trying as much as they can to get this negotiating power to infiltrate the global south, infiltrate BRICS, and tariffs is the perfect strategy to do it. Take any country that is dependent upon exports, that is in debt to the IMF, crash their currencies, and do a negotiation, not for America, but for the financial institutions and the global corporations. They're going to asset strip those countries and then work with deploying capital as a result of this consolidation, just like COVID, which was the reason that Trump was installed. And we ended up with this strategy to weaken the dollar, redeploy capital, reset the world order, rather than go to World War III in recognition that America, Europe had completely extracted all of its resources away from its people. And now it's manufacturing consent through technology for exactly what it always accused China of doing. And that's what the future is looking like. Back to the video.
Procurement policies based on best value. It must help countries move away from procurement approaches that prioritize only the lowest cost bids. Such procurement policies reward distortive and subsidized industrial policies that undermine development. They may also stifle the private sector and incentivize corruption and collusion and result in greater long-term cost. Procurement policies based on best value are better from both an efficiency and development perspective, and their robust implementation will benefit the bank and its shareholders. Related to this subject, I wish to send a strong, and I emphasize strong, message about procurement policies as regards Ukraine. No one who financed or supplied the Russian war machine will be eligible for funds earmarked for Ukraine's reconstruction. No one. To conclude, I invite our allies to work with us as we rebalance the international financial system, refocus the IMF and World Bank on their founding charters. America First means we are doubling down on our engagement with the international economic system, including at the IMF and the World Bank. A more sustainable economic system will be one that better serves the interests of the United States and all the other participants in the system. We look forward to working with all of you in this endeavor. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's going to do it. You are witnessing one of the most changing times in financial history, which is the end of the Bretton Woods post-World War II economic hitmen proof of weapons network, which was slowly transitioned, and all of the central banks and all of the financial institutions and all of the deals that are being put together are all in the name of asset stripping Americans, Europeans, British people, Israeli people, because they set the game. The game was that Israel had 1 year before the Trump administration in order to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians after the false flag operation on October the 7th was put in place in order to determine what the New World Order is. At the same time, the agitation of Russia in order to strategically determine whether BRICS could be strategically weakened or America could remain the hegemon is now hitting the negotiation stage because Netanyahu did not meet his goal and the CIA lost 2 BRICS. And rather than go to World War III, Layer 1 and Layer 2 said they could end up destroying everything if we end up in World War III. Instead, we're going to shrink America to a regional power. We're going to sacrifice Europe. We're going to normalize Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia by retreating from the Middle East. And we're going to allow China, because it aligned with BRICS, because it aligned with Iran, and because it aligned with India and various other regions, we're going to allow them to invest while we have our final little battles. We're going to give Israel as much negotiation power by escalating in Yemen. We're going to see what the role of India and China is by deciding and the final resolutions in Pakistan. And we're going to have these final battles. And we'll tell Trump he can have the Nobel Peace Prize while he does Abraham Accords as a reward. He gets to profit from all of these deals, all of his administration. They get to get their own stable coins and take on the social credit score, technocracy. They get to get all of their deals. They get to reinvest. They get to have a little bit of their fund with the GCC via Harry Kushner that's been investing in the region. And all they need to do is pretend that they're trying to make America great again and leave the everyday American, the everyday European with the bag while they asset strip the final resources. And all you need to do is recognize what they're doing. The central banks are going into gold, managing the transition. The large financial institutions via BlackRock and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and all the other financial institutions were put into Bitcoin. Neutral assets is where people are holding their wealth while they figure out what happens. Bitcoin, which was created in 2008 via a white paper and launched in 2009, a network of proof of work that was the largest distributed supercomputer in the world, is now distributed its hash power across the entire world where no country can take it down. And because of that, Operation Choke Point 2.0 was implemented by the SEC and the Federal Reserve with strategic implants like Alex Mizhinsky in Celsius and SBF in FTX, and wrecked the industry, sent those people to prison while pensioners lost their money. And then the strategic tension was escalated through the Russian invasion of Ukraine to reset the prices of oil, create an inflationary cycle, create a run on the banks, wipe out Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and Silvergate Bank so that the crypto-friendly banks could no longer service the industry while they changed the administration. And because Netanyahu didn't ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and Russia ended up winning the land and BlackRock is being negotiated, everything is now being negotiated for the large financial institutions, the asset stripping of Americans, the fall of the European empire, the rise of GCC, the rise of BRICS, and all the investments that they can make in the different nations. And what did they do? They allowed BlackRock to launch the Bitcoin ETF so they could get their financial institutions in it. They then started to lift, under the Trump administration, the restrictions on banks engaging in Bitcoin. They then allowed Strategy to accumulate 500,000 Bitcoin by leveraging shorting the dollar and getting more and more risky products in there, and having other companies like Cantor Fitzgerald, which is a direct broker that sells bonds directly from the Federal Reserve, one of the 25, that has a deep state connection, to work with Tether and other Bitcoiners like Jack Mallers and announce 21 Inc. Capital to create stable coins that can be the bag holders for the treasuries, that can benefit from the high rates because America's broke and needs to refinance its debt, and no one believes it. So the 10-year treasuries and 30-year treasuries are rising so that they can copy what Tether did, which is short dollar, and use that yield, the last barrel of America refinancing at higher rates, to buy Bitcoin, enter into not a Bitcoin strategic reserve for America, but a Bitcoin strategic reserve for all the players that exerted this, and end up with their own stable coins, their own Bitcoin strategic reserves, while America transitions to a technocracy. And they are now deregulating the system, and they want you to put as many of your Bitcoins with BlackRock in the ETF, and as many of your Bitcoins in Strategy, and as many of your Bitcoins into 21 Inc., while Cantor Fitzgerald becomes the Bitcoin investment bank for centralizing as many of the Bitcoins as possible and trying to scam you into not having money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply, so that the next time the Federal Reserve wants to hike rates or lower rates, I think I've frozen on the screen, the next time they want to do that, they can trick you into borrowing against your Bitcoin, just like they did with Celsius, just like FTX did in order with the hedge fund money, so that you end up getting margin called, lose all your Bitcoin, and they can take your Bitcoin because they are the manipulators of money. But guess what? Bitcoin is proof of work, so it doesn't matter who owns it. But if you own it through them, mark my words, we will come back to the video just like I did in the Russia-Ukraine one in 2 years from now, and you'll see how FTX and Celsius was executed by the banksters and hedge funds and Federal Reserve via Cantor Fitzgerald and the apparatus that was set up during the Trump administration, and the banks and financial institutions that are trying to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet so that they can socialize the losses and privatize the gains and transition to a stablecoin standard after beta testing it with a CBDC on Europe and beta testing their artificial intelligence in the Middle East that they've already done, so that they can trick you into imparting from your Bitcoin because they want your gold and they want your Bitcoin, and they're short the dollar, and they're repositioning themselves and trying to leave you as the bag holder, and then eventually they can strip their Bitcoin from you by persuading you to borrow against it. In 2 years' time, we'll create the video, and I guarantee you that we will see this effect that was created in order to scam those Bitcoins from you. But beautiful thing is that Satoshi Nakamoto fought through this. Satoshi Nakamoto knew this was going to happen, and he knew that you can have money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has no key person risk, that has a fixed monetary policy that can't be manipulated by any central bank unless you give them your Bitcoin. And that's what they're doing. That's why America wants to be the center of crypto, to get their stablecoin standard. That's why America wants to build their Bitcoin strategic reserves, not for America, but for those that are asset stripping the system and were installed in order to scam you out of your Bitcoin by persuading you to borrow against your Bitcoin. We'll come back. But remember, just follow the money and stop listening to them. They're putting their money in gold. they're putting their money in Bitcoin, and they're experimenting with central bank digital currencies in Europe and stablecoin technocracies. And they learned the model from the social credit score that Elon bought the Trump administration to install for the military industrial complex as they consolidate all of these firms, reset the world order, and allow for a new era where the world will be liberated from the dollar. April the 2nd, 2025, Dollar Liberation Day. And we get the opportunity, as long as we follow the money, to fight back against it, because the real battle was not America versus China. The real battle was not Republicans versus Democrats. The real battle was not the Jewish conspiracy versus the Muslim invasions. They created all of that game to divide and conquer, distract us, extract our resources. The real battle is decentralization versus centralization. And all of those PSYOP crypto scams were ways of VCs extracting your Bitcoin from you. And the real value was proof of work designed via Satoshi Nakamoto so that we can own our money, spend our money, and we can have a monetary policy that nobody can change. And we can build decentralized AI and decentralized identity and decentralized social and decentralized internet, just like we decentralized money, and they could not beat us. So they created as many financial products as possible to make sure that you lose your Bitcoin to them as they short the dollar, create more financial products, and persuade you to borrow against their Bitcoin. Because the debt-based Ponzi scheme now has competition. And that competition is self-sovereignty. And the way we beat this system is by localizing. We don't take on their debt, because that drains the system. Every dollar invested in Bitcoin and held in self-custody is an FU to the system. You spending local avoids the technocracy, and us creating decentralized artificial intelligence that can optimize for what is inevitably happening right now is that they will use Bitcoin as the currency. And eventually these governments and states won't be able to tax. They want to get to their one world currency. Well, it's created and it's decentralized and they don't have to control it as long as we keep Bitcoin as decentralized as possible. But fortunately, it doesn't matter who owns it. They can only manipulate the price, and they will create as many games as possible to make you, through fear, uncertainty, and doubt, sell your Bitcoin to them or leverage your Bitcoin to them. But self-sovereignty is Bitcoin and self-custody powered by open source code and the largest world distributed supercomputer with 1,000 exahashes that powers it. And the intrinsic value of Bitcoin was self-custody without having a bank, spending without government or bank permission, and monetary policy with no key person risk that nobody can change. And that is intrinsic value. And when they're trying to send their gold around the world and they don't trust each other, they'll figure out that the network that can be audited in real time with digital scarcity that nobody can change, where the supply is actually known into the future, is the one that artificial intelligence will eventually choose. And we've already got the model. Spend local. Don't take on debt. Don't engage in their fiat currency, financial weapons of mass destruction. Save in Bitcoin, and we can win the game. Those that don't do that, they'll be on the wrong side of financial history. I want you to be on the right side of financial history, and we can do it with peace, love, and unity, while the proof of weapons network slowly gets demonetized by proof of work. And even if none of that happens, you get to be self-sovereign. You get to work with your community. You get to defund the central banks in your life, and you get to gain economic power because hard money wins in the end. And that's how we win. You just got to not fall for the PSYOP. We can do it with peace. I hope you enjoyed this speech. I hope you enjoyed the retranslation, and I hope you're not going to be as gullible into divide and conquer, because that's what they need. And we win with Bitcoin. Peace.